This section of the lesson discusses the content that's usually found in Chapter 1 of a dissertation or master's thesis proposal in the ASTE department. We're very blessed to know that the content listed on this slide is typical of what you're going to see in extension education, agricultural communications, agriculture education, or family and consumer science education. All these are related to career and technical education. The material will be presented in the same order as identified on this slide. I do need you to understand that the material I present is not going to be the exact items in your proposal. Many master's degree committees do not have our students including methodology or theoretical framework sections. More doctoral dissertation proposals include the theoretical framework, methodology, and delimitations. It's best to talk to your committee chair to know what content to include so that it's easy to go through the process and know that you're not missing anything or that you've included something that's unnecessary prior to your defense of your proposal. This section is intended to provide a context for your study. Ordinarily, the background section will take 2 to 5 pages. Again, depending upon the nature of your study and your own approach to writing. It answers this question: what special factors were at work that might possibly have influenced the conceptualization and execution of the study? Some committees also expect the discussion of the background to explain how your proposed study will contribute to the knowledge base. In identifying the background factors, ask yourself these questions. What trends are occurring in the field? What new developments are most promising? If someone read this proposal 20 years from now, what would the reader want to know about the background? What is the general state of knowledge about the research problem? In this section, you might also deal with special background factors. The societal background or be developments and changes in the society that made the problem seem important. The intellectual background, major intellectual and philosophical movements of the time that provide a special context for your study. Perhaps professional background, developments in your field that made the problem seem worth studying. Then the research background, maybe new methods that seemed worth using or new theories that seemed to need testing or gaps in the existing knowledge for your topic. You conclude the background section with a concise sentence or two that just leads into the statement of the problem. Your statement of the problem, also known as the problem statement, just presents a formal and succinct statement of the problem that you're going to investigate. It answers the question of what is being done in your study. You must establish that the problem is an important one and that's feasible to research it. That is, the answer to the problem will lie in the data obtained. You pick a problem that you have a genuine professional interest in, one that you do not have a personal interest in, to the extent that you are not out to prove something. Such emotional ties often blind you from the resulting data and prohibit you from drawing conclusions and discussing the topic in an unbiased manner. Or you're going to have to acknowledge your biases as a researcher and write about it in Chapter 3. For your statement of the problem, we tend to find that there are 4 circumstances that lead to thinking a topic is worth studying as a research problem. There's little to no research on the topic, that some research exists, but it's not really been applied to enough samples or to our discipline or to enough situations that it becomes a reliable phenomenon. Sometimes the findings are contradictory in previous studies and you want to use a different situation to add to that knowledge. And then maybe 2 theories explain the same phenomenon but recommend or predict different outcomes. These can all lead to why you selected your research problem and why it's worth studying. I'm not going to do a lot of review over the purpose of the study, but just state succinctly how you're going to solve the stated problem. We typically start with the purpose of the study will be to, and then it's an action verb related to the type of research that you're studying, whether it's descriptive or correlational, ex post facto or experimental, and then usually the variables and audience that you're working on, your population. I'm also not going to cover objectives, research questions, and hypotheses in great deal. But your objectives are best located after your purpose for your study in a numbered list, and it indicates the data that you're collecting, and it has to make a clear connection between your objectives, your laid questions or your hypotheses, and then to your literature and to your theoretical framework, as well back to your research problem, because you're using these objectives to answer and solve your research problem. Specific objectives take the form of, surveys, correlational or quantitative research, and you typically use objectives. Some use research questions. A lot of times ex post facto or experimental research use hypotheses, and your qualitative research a lot of times will be framed in research questions. You typically write them in a numbered list so it can be clearly identified later in Chapter 3 as well as for Chapter 4, where you'll write the results for each of these objectives or research questions. You state at least 2 or 3 in a numbered list. Sometimes you can have more. I've seen studies with 6 or 7. But just remember that they influence the decisions about running your project. It influences your population, your sample, your data collection, your analysis, everything about your methodology. Research objectives tend to start with an action verb in the present tense for your proposal. Here is an example of commonly used verbs that are for surveys, correlational research, ex post facto research, or experimental designs. An example research objective is to describe respondents' existing attitudes toward U.S. agriculture industry and food-related public organizations. Here are a few others from other disciplines within our department. Your research questions, we have 3 types. You have your descriptive questions that ask what phenomenon is using data collected from interviews, questionnaires, observations, content analyses. It really just answers like the question of what it is. Then you have relationship questions. They tend to examine the correlation between 2 or more variables. And then you have difference questions. These explain differences that exist between groups or between participants, making comparisons using either quantitative or qualitative data. You might come across a few errors. For example, I'll see students mix between research questions and research objectives when writing their proposal. It's either one or the other. You don't mix them up, and it needs to be in a single list. I see a concern when students will look at the purpose of the study and then actually make that the research objective. And so I would encourage you to read a few examples, look at some of the published theses and dissertations, and then get a sense of what is frequently done in the discipline so that you're comfortable in writing a purpose statement, then aligning it with your research objectives or research questions. You can include hypotheses. A hypothesis is a researcher's prediction or explanation of what the results will show. In research, hypotheses involve 2 or more variables, such as time on a task and achievement, or hypotheses are really derived by a theory. So as you review your literature about your research problem, you could be looking for theory-derived hypotheses, and when a hypothesis is stated in a positive form, it's often termed a research hypothesis. You'll frequently see research hypotheses accompany a research question and correlational or causal comparative studies. In the section about the significance of your study, you're going to answer the question, why did you bother to conduct this study? And in answering this question, your tone is important. You don't want to claim too much. You also don't need to be rather specific about the need of your study. You need to be able to indicate by a careful analysis that your study is important from more than one point of view, and the significance is addressed by discussing how the study adds to the theoretical body of knowledge in the field and the study's practical significance for professionals in the field. Grounds for the research might come from expert opinions or through emerging questions of prior studies, conflicting findings in other studies, the evolution of methodologies, or political, social, or psychological trends. A lot of times we'll see them written as if-then statements. So if this happens, then this will be the result. And this phrasing can be very nice hypothetical deductive logic provided in your writing that helps justify why your study is important. An introductory sentence is usually used to transition to the definition of terms. The terms in this section should be terms directly related to your research that will be used by you throughout your research. Because your proposal is targeted to an academic audience, it's unnecessary to exhaustively define every term that a lay audience would not understand. One should keep the academic audience in mind when reviewing the list with one's chair and deciding appropriate terms to include in this section. All of the variables in your research hypotheses, your purpose, your questions, your objectives should be defined. And then theories and models should also be defined. The terms in this section are terms that are directly tied to your research. So these definitions can be obtained from a dictionary or a professional reference source, academic journals, literature, textbooks. It's often the case that scholars you reference will have developed their own definition, and you can cite that, or you can review various definitions that have surfaced in your literature and then synthesize your own definition, showing why it's more appropriate than the other definitions, and then citing those sources to show from where you derived your own definition. Some proposals will include a theoretical framework. This is typically a few paragraphs that just introduce the key concepts of your theoretical framework, that generate your research questions, your objectives that are guiding your research design, your data collection, your data analysis, and even the presentation of your findings. You are going to expand on your theoretical framework in Chapter 2, but by introducing it in Chapter 1, you're just giving your readers a heads up, and it's helping them connect all of these different sections together to better understand your project. Your methodology section is optional. In Chapter 1, this tends to be a summary of the methodology and contains a brief outline of 3 things. The participants in a qualitative study or the subjects in a quantitative study. Human participants are referred to as participants, though non-human subjects are referred to as subjects. The instrumentation used to collect data, and then the procedures that will be followed. These elements are all going to be reported in greater detail in Chapter 3, but it does help explain how you're going to collect the data that's going to answer your research objective or questions that's going to solve your research problem. So a lot of times I like to see a methodology section because I think it just helps your readers set up for Chapter 3. Limitations are the limitations for which you, the researcher, have no control over. These might include resources for your topic which are limiting you from doing more extensive study, or in the case of active research, subjects who cannot complete the test items, or COVID-19 changing perhaps access to your population and your sample, or lack of whatever might cause you to eliminate a person from your study. This section may not be applicable to the treatment of your topic. I do encourage you to seek advice, but a lot of times you want to state your limitations because it avoids having your readers misinterpret your findings or try to generalize your findings to the population when that might not be appropriate. Delimitations are limitations on the research design that are imposed deliberately by you, the researcher. The delimitation section establishes the limits or the perimeters that you choose to include and to leave out. Delimitations in social sciences studies would be such things as a specific school district where the study took place, the number of repetitions in an experiment, the population to be sampled, selection criteria, the demographic data included in your data analysis. The delimitation section should not be confused with the limitation section. Those factors are covered of which an investigator has no control. The delimitation section is sometimes called the scope of the study. Assumptions are those things that, relative to your study, you're taking for granted. Assumptions are self-evident truths. So in a qualitative study, it may be assumed that participants be highly qualified in the study if the study is about administrators for school districts. It could be assumed that those participants will answer truthfully and accurately to the interview questions based on their personal experience, and that the participants will respond honestly and to the best of their individual abilities. You state these assumptions in a series of numbered sentences as briefly as possible so that what is assumed is clear. And in the statement of the assumption, consider stating the reasons. If there is a reason for believing an assumption is true, state that reason. And you may find it easier to write this section as you are developing your methodology in Chapter 3. Each chapter of a dissertation or a master's thesis proposal contains 3 main sections. You have the introduction or chapter overview, where you'll tell your readers what you're going to tell them. Then you have the body, where you tell them. And then you have a summary, where you tell them what you just told them. However, because Chapter 1 is titled Introduction, it doesn't begin with a heading introduction like the chapters 2 and chapters 3 a lot of times. What you're going to see is it doesn't end with a heading called summary. Instead, we begin the chapter with a heading background of the study, and it ends with a heading organization of the study. And this section of a dissertation or master's thesis proposal describes the content found in the subsequent chapters of the entire dissertation or master's thesis proposal. And after your proposal defense, you will go back and edit your organization of the study because you're going to have to factor in chapters 4 and chapters 5. This concludes the information of what to expect in Chapter 1. And I want to thank you for joining me, and I encourage you to contact me through Canvas inbox with additional questions.